Every 40,000 video you've ever watched tells you the same thing. It's always negative. There's never a happy day. Every job is a death sentence. That's a direct quote from the community, and it reportedly appeared in community discussion around a competitor video, a claim that couldn't be independently verified, so treat both the sentiment and the source as directional rather than confirmed. But the frustration it represents is real, and it points at something worth examining. And here's what's interesting about that. It tells you almost nothing about the 40K universe, and almost everything about the content machine that covers it. Because somewhere in the 41st millennium, a figure stands on the bridge of a vessel that belongs entirely to them. Not leased, not commissioned, not borrowed from a chapter or a navy fleet, but personally owned, dynastically inherited, legally guaranteed. They carry a document so rare that the lore never bothers to give you a count of how many exist at any given moment. That document is a warrant of trade, and the person holding it commands a personal fleet, supersedes planetary governors, operates with the full sanction of the High Lords of Terra, and can do things in the name of profit and exploration that would get literally anyone else executed by morning. The grimdark content machine never told you about that. This video does. The thesis isn't that the 41st millennium is secretly pleasant. It isn't. The horror is real, the death is everywhere, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. But a prosecutorial review of the lore reveals something the content ecosystem has been burying. Some lives in the 41st millennium don't just rival modern Earth, they beat it outright. And the audience has been suspecting this for years without anyone bothering to prove it with receipts. So let's start with the receipts. Before we get to the good lives, one data point from the other side. Because the grimdark connoisseurs watching this deserve an anchor before the pivot. In Graham McNeil's novel, Storm of Iron, the Iron Warriors don't treat their mortal soldiers as auxiliaries or assets. They treat them as material, as mass. Men are fed into siege lines not to achieve victory through tactics, but to test enemy firepower, measure defensive response, and establish viable breach points through the simple accumulation of casualties. Their primarch, Perturabo, elevated this to doctrine. Your death, in his calculus, was a measurement tool. That's where we're starting from. That's the baseline universe we're describing. Because when the rogue trader enters the frame, you need to understand what they're operating above. Now, the Warrant of Trade. The franchise was literally named after these people. When Games Workshop published the very first edition of Warhammer 40,000 in 1987, they didn't call it Space Marines or the Grimdark Universe or Eternal War. They called it Rogue Trader. The independent merchant explorer operating at the Imperium's fringe was the original lens through which this entire universe was meant to be seen. The concept of the Warrant of Trade is built into the setting's foundation, not an afterthought, not a sidebar, but the original premise. The Fantasy Flight Games Rogue Trader role-playing core book, published in 2009, contains the most detailed mechanical and legal description of what a warrant actually grants. Warrants of Trade are hereditary documents issued with the sanction of the High Lords of Terra, the Imperium's ruling council, conferring trading rights and extraordinary legal immunity across a scope that almost defies description. The holder can supersede planetary governors in trading matters and frontier expansion. They can operate beyond the Imperium's formal borders. Activities that would be capital offenses for an ordinary citizen, dealing in Xenos artifacts, making contact with alien species, trading outside sanctioned channels, fall within their legal remit. The scarcity is part of the architecture. Warrants aren't mass-issued documents handed out by a committee. The lore describes them as genuinely rare, rare enough that holding one marks you as a categorically different class of human being from everyone else in Imperial space. A planetary governor runs a world. A warrant holder supersedes them. The lore suggests some warrants date back to the Great Crusade, to the era of the Emperor himself, when the mechanism was first established to push human expansion into the galaxy's unmapped territories using private enterprise rather than purely military force. These dynastic documents may have been passing through bloodlines for 10,000 years. The legal weight they carry is, by design, essentially unchallenged. Here's the analogy that snaps it into focus. A warrant of trade is a license to be a tech billionaire with no regulatory body, no oversight committee, and a personal navy. One sentence. That's it. That's the whole comparison. Now consider what the lifestyle actually looks like. Black library fiction has documented rogue traders as operators in what the lore politely calls morally gray zones. Xenos artifact trading, which carries the death penalty for anyone without a warrant, is essentially a business line. Political influence with imperial nobility flows naturally from the trade networks. A rogue trader who moves valuable commodities between systems accumulates favors with highborn families the way a private equity firm accumulates board seats. The internal crew structure mirrors a corporate hierarchy with the wealth disparities to match. The trader at the top lives in a manner entirely disconnected from the ratings laboring in the ship's lower decks. The ships themselves are worth dwelling on. A rogue trader's flagship isn't a navy vessel on loan. It's a personal asset, dynastically inherited alongside the warrant, crewed by thousands of people whose entire lives unfold within its hull. Some rogue trader operations encompass multiple vessels. The phrase personal fleet appears in the lore without irony. These are privately owned warships. The rogue trader doesn't apply for funding or requisition support. They deploy assets they already own in service of objectives they set themselves, operating in territories where imperial law is essentially theoretical. Beat 3 of 4, and this is the one that tends to land hardest with the audience who works in offices and recognizes it immediately. The Imperium is described across multiple academic analyses as a rigid, totalitarian hierarchy. Sources examining the franchise as a cultural artifact consistently describe it as intolerant of internal dissent, a system that can't accommodate ambitious individuals who accumulate power laterally within its own structure. The fascinating thing about the Warrant of Trade, when you read the institutional logic rather than just the romantic surface of it, is that it functions as a mechanism for exiling dangerous ambition outward. The lore doesn't state this explicitly. This is the inference hiding in plain sight, a plausible reading of lore patterns that the community may recognize without anyone having written it down. And it should be understood as analysis rather than canon. But the pattern the lore implies is suggestive. The Imperium may not eliminate its most capable and ambitious people when they become politically threatening. It sends them beyond the borders. It hands them a document that makes everything they want to do legal, attaches a fleet and a mandate, and points them at the unmapped dark. From the Imperium's perspective, they've solved the problem. The ambitious noble who might otherwise start accumulating internal influence is now 3 months warp travel away, busy claiming worlds in the Emperor's name and enriching themselves in the process. Every sufficiently large corporation has a version of this. The senior partner who becomes difficult to manage doesn't get fired. They get promoted sideways into a consulting role and handed a budget. The Imperium has been doing this for 10,000 years at a galactic scale with warships. And now beat 4, the catch. The catch is that the warrant doesn't protect you from your own trajectory. The lore references Navy authority over cargo seizure, a rogue trader whose operations drift into territory the Navy classifies as threatening can have their goods impounded. The administratum can fine for late tithes. A dynasty that stretches back thousands of years can empty its coffers in a generation if the operational costs of maintaining a fleet outpace the returns from trading. Those mechanics are real and documented. Navy seizures, administratum penalties, dynasty-ending debt spirals. The rogue trader lifestyle is extraordinary precisely because it's a high-wire act with no safety net. The same scarcity that makes a warrant extraordinary makes a warrant holder's failure catastrophic and final. When an ordinary citizen loses everything, they have nothing. When a rogue trader loses everything, they lose a dynasty that may have survived for 10,000 years. The golden cage is still a cage. Some people would kill to live inside it, but the bars are real. That's 4 beats on rogue traders. Time to look at the galaxy's other survivable addresses. The lore's world classification system contains an entry called Paradise Worlds. The Lexicanum acknowledges them. The caveat worth issuing up front: the canon detail on these worlds is genuinely thin, and what lore exists describes them primarily as destinations for the imperial elite, rather than general civilian populations. What the lore suggests, rather than confirms, is that they function as retreat destinations for those imperial elite, somewhere the pressures of the wider war have never visibly landed. The evidence stops short of confirming specific daily conditions for ordinary residents. But the inference is worth building even with thin sourcing, because of what it implies about the broader picture. And here it's worth separating the elite retreat of a paradise world from the rather different existence implied by feudal worlds and agri-worlds, where ordinary civilians actually live. Source 22 in the research underlying this video, an academic analysis titled "Hope as the Main Driving Force of Humanity in the Grimdark Universe of Warhammer 40,000, contains the phrase, "entire generations living and dying without ever seeing the sky." That's describing hive worlds, continent-spanning cities where billions of people are born, work, and die beneath layers of metal and rock, never once looking at a sun. The horror of that phrase isn't that it describes the universe, it's that it describes one world type, and the contrast implied by its existence is that other world types are defined by its absence. A feudal world, an agri-world. On those worlds, what the lore suggests is that generations live and die in something resembling a medieval agricultural society. Not utopia, not safety, but also not a hive city's grinding servitude, not a war zone's daily attrition, not the existential pressure of a forge world running triple shifts for 10,000 years. The Administratum's tithe system can strip an agri-world bare. That's the catch, and it's a documented one. A famine on a food-producing planet isn't a paradox in the 41st millennium. It's bureaucratic policy. But the baseline existence, absent that extraction? The lore's silence on these worlds is itself the answer. Nobody writes about them because nothing is happening. One commenter put it concisely: "You can probably have a pretty chill life in the Imperium." They're right. The content machine just never bothered to film that episode. Now the deliberate provocation. The Tau Empire. This is the controversial pick, and it's deliberately controversial, because the 40K community can't agree on what the Tau actually are, and that disagreement is more interesting than a clean answer. The structure of Tau society is confirmed across multiple codex editions. 5 castes. Fire for military service. Water for diplomacy and trade. Earth for construction, labor, and farming. Air for scouting and piloting, and the ethereals at the top, providing leadership and ideological coherence. Each caste has a defined function. The greater good provides the philosophical framework, collective benefit as the operating principle of a society, the individual's role defined by contribution to the whole. What the underlying research documents is this: the greater good ideology provides food security, shelter, and basic health care. The Guavesa, humans who join the Tau, human auxiliaries integrated into the Empire's structure, are documented as receiving these benefits. A human who defects to the Tau gets absorbed into a functioning caste system that guarantees their basic needs in exchange for accepting their role within it. Compared to the average hive world denizen, who enjoys none of those guarantees and faces existential threat on a geological timescale, the Tau offer something that, with charitable framing, resembles a managed social democracy with decent public services. That's the comparison. Managed social democracy. One sentence. Now the catch, because there is always a catch. The ethereals exercise control over the other castes that the lore has never cleanly resolved. Whether that control is literal biochemical or pheromonal compulsion, something hardwired into Tau biology, or whether it's ideological conformism enforced through social pressure and cultural saturation, The source record can't definitively confirm. What's not contested is the functional outcome. The Tau don't produce dissidents at any significant rate. The greater good doesn't get argued with. Individual ambition that conflicts with collective assignment doesn't flourish. The freedom that the Imperium's various brutal mechanisms accidentally preserve, by being too chaotic and spread thin to enforce ideological purity everywhere, the Tau simply engineer out of the equation. So the welfare state comparison holds, conditionally. Food security, shelter, healthcare, social purpose, freedom from constant existential threat. Yes, on a Tau world, the lore suggests those exist. Freedom of thought, freedom of ambition, freedom to want something your caste didn't assign you. Those are the price of admission, and the ethereals collect them quietly and completely. Whether that's a good trade depends entirely on what you value, which is exactly the kind of question the comment section exists to fight about. There's a chapter in the Space Marines roster that functions as a brief but necessary corrective to the broad assumption that Astartes treat civilian populations as acceptable losses. The Salamanders don't. Nick Kime's Salamanders trilogy, and specifically the novel Nocturne, documents Forge Master Tushan's actions protecting Nocturne's civilian population. The cultural basis for this isn't tactical or strategic. Nocturne's culture, as reflected in the chapter itself, emphasizes craftsman ideals and community defense. The Salamanders return to their homeworld regularly, maintain relationships with Nocturne's people, and treat civilian casualties as a failure condition rather than an acceptable variable. In engagements where other chapters would advance through a civilian population to achieve an objective, the Salamanders absorb additional costs to avoid that outcome. The important caveat, sourced directly from the research audit, the Salamanders aren't the only chapter to ever protect civilians. What distinguishes them is that it's a cultural priority, not a tactical choice made when convenient. That's a meaningful distinction in a setting where the dominant doctrine, across most of the Imperium's military apparatus, is that the individual matters less than the mission. The catch for Space Marine existence in general, including the best version of it, is that it isn't civilian life at all. The genetic modification that produces an Astartes removes them from ordinary human experience entirely. They don't reproduce. They don't retire. They don't form the kinds of relationships that constitute what most people would call a life. The Salamanders protect civilians. They can't be civilians. The best Space Marine existence is a life of total service with no exit condition, and no human equivalent outside of the most demanding military institutions on Earth. It's extraordinary. It's also a permanent commitment that ends only with death, which brings every thread in this video back to the same structural truth about the 41st millennium. The grimdark consensus exists for a reason. The horror is real. It's documented across thousands of pages of lore, and the content machine didn't fabricate suffering out of nothing. The Iron Warriors burning through mortal soldiers as measurement tools, that's Graham McNeil's text, not an exaggeration. The Hive City generations who never see the sky, that's an academic citation from a lore text, not a rhetorical device. The administratum that can fine a rogue trader dynasty into collapse, or strip an agri-world bare for a tithe shortfall, those mechanisms are canonical. But the content machine did something the lore didn't authorize. It took a universe the size of a galaxy, a setting with thousands of world types, dozens of factions, institutional structures ranging from the brutally totalitarian to the merely feudal, and a legal mechanism that produces what are functionally immortal billionaire warlords with personal navies, and it chose to film only the bottom half. Every video, the same angle, the same torment, the same thesis. There are no good days. There is only suffering. Every job is a death sentence. That framing served a content niche. It didn't describe the universe. A rogue trader dynasty that has survived for 10,000 years, commanding a fleet of personally owned warships, trading in Xenos artifacts the rest of the Imperium isn't allowed to touch, superseding planetary governors on the basis of a document issued by the High Lords of Terra, that life exists in the same 41st millennium as the siege lines of the Iron Warriors. Simultaneously, in the same galaxy. And the dynasty will keep existing, keep accumulating, keep operating in the unmapped dark, right up until one bad quarter of Imperial Navy attention and administratum paperwork reduces it to a cautionary tale. The Golden Cage. Still a cage. Still the best address most people in the 41st millennium will never come close to. On a Tau world somewhere, a Govesa farmer who grew up under a hive city's metal ceiling now works a field under an open sky, eats regularly, and doesn't spend much time wondering whether the ethereal's contentment they feel is authentic or engineered. On a feudal world or an agri-world, what the lore suggests is an ordinary life in something resembling a medieval agricultural society, a place where the grinding machinery of the wider war has never visibly arrived. On Nocturne, an old craftsman repairs a wall the salamanders help defend, and the chapter's return is a scheduled cultural event rather than an emergency. And somewhere in the warp, a rogue trader's flagship drops back into real space after 3 months in the dark, holds up its warrant of trade at a border checkpoint, and watches the checkpoint's officer do the bureaucratic math before waving them through without inspection. The 41st millennium is vast enough to contain all of these simultaneously. That makes it more interesting, not less dark. The worst human conditions and the best ones, separated by nothing but distance, luck, blood, and the right piece of paper. The content machine lied by omission, not the darkness. That part was accurate, just everything else. If that's the kind of lore analysis you want more of, subscribe. There's more where this came from.